Imagine an abandoned Roman villa at dawn. Imperial guards move through its shadowed corridors, searching for someone who doesn't want to be found. In the cool stone cellar, they discover a young man, barely 20, clutching a small vial. He is pale, trembling, and not just anyone. This is Sporus, once paraded through Rome as an empress, now cornered and desperate to escape whatever fate the new ruler has planned for him. How did a boy born in the imperial household become the unwilling double of a dead empress? To answer that, we have to step back 3 years, to a moment when grief, power, and obsession collided in the mind of an emperor. What follows isn't a simple tale of Roman decadence. It's one of the most unsettling stories of identity ever recorded, drawn from the chronicles of Rome itself. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below. Let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman excess. The story of how absolute power can transform love into obsession, grief into madness, and a human being into a living doll created to serve one man's twisted fantasy. Rome, 65 CE. The empire is at its height, and Nero sits on the throne. Brilliant, impulsive, and dangerous. That year, tragedy strikes inside the palace walls. The death of his wife, Poppaea Sabina. Some sources suggest a sudden act of violence. Others speak of an argument that spiraled out of control. However it happened, the loss unravels Nero. Poppaea had been more than an imperial consort. Ancient writers describe her as dazzling. Amber-gold hair, luminous skin, eyes so large that poets compared them to those of Venus herself. Nero's grief quickly slips beyond mourning. He refuses the usual funeral rites, has her body treated with rare spices, dressed in regal garments, and laid in a crystal coffin so he can still see her face. Servants whisper about the emperor speaking to the sarcophagus, setting a place for her at meals, preserving her rooms exactly as she left them. As weeks pass, the emperor's fixation deepens. He commissions portraits and statues, urging artists to capture not just Poppaea's likeness but her spirit. When no image feels real enough, he rages or weeps. He begins searching for her reflection among Rome's women, in a servant carrying wine, in a senator's wife, in strangers on the street. The court waits for the spell to break, but it doesn't. Then, late that year, while reviewing routine appointments, Nero notices a youth newly promoted to a clerical post. The boy's name is Sporus. He is educated, soft-spoken, with an unusual resemblance to the lost empress, especially in his eyes, which are wide and amber-flecked. Witnesses say the emperor froze, then studied him with a strange intensity, as if he had stumbled on a way to reverse death itself. Sporus, raised within the palace as the child of a captured servant, suddenly finds himself at the center of the emperor's attention. Nero questions him gently, then more insistently, noting every detail. The way he tilts his head, how light plays on his features. In that moment, the youth's own identity begins to disappear, replaced by the shape of an impossible expectation. Over the following days, Sporus is housed in lavish rooms near the emperor's quarters. Artists compare his profile with portraits of Poppaea. Physicians discuss adjustments that might bring him closer to her image. Nero teaches him to mimic her voice, her posture, even the way she extended certain vowels when she spoke. Piece by piece, the emperor tries to rebuild the woman he lost, not in marble or paint, but in the living body of another human being. What followed for Sporus was an ordeal few in the ancient world could even imagine. Every detail of his behavior was scrutinized. Anything that didn't fit the image Nero demanded was corrected. Even his name was taken from him, replaced with titles meant for a noblewoman. His plain garments were exchanged for silks in Poppaea's favorite colors, and tutors drilled him in speech, movement, and etiquette until the line between himself and the lost empress blurred. Ancient accounts suggest that, over time, Sporus spoke less and moved like someone trapped in a waking dream, aware that any protest could cost him his life. Nero's plans went further still. He imagined reshaping the young courtier into a living echo of the woman he'd lost, and physicians, under threat and promise in equal measure, were pressed into creating procedures the empire had never seen before. Whatever happened in those guarded rooms was harrowing. Records only hint at the cost to Sporus's body and spirit. During the long recovery, Nero hovered constantly, speaking of Poppaea's poetry, her favorite perfumes, her laughter, folding these stories into Sporus's fragile sense of self. As strength returned, tutors taught him the arts of a Roman matron. The slow, gliding walk, the careful use of hands at table, the studied brightness of polite conversation. Tailors and jewelers worked from preserved garments and ornaments, fitting them to Sporus so that, in soft lamplight, he could be mistaken for the empress herself. Historians later wrote of how courtiers sometimes glimpsed the youth beneath the performance, a flash of wit or sadness that belonged to no one but him, before fear closed over his expression again. Then came Nero's announcement. He would marry the youth publicly, with all the ceremony due an imperial bride. Preparations swept through Rome. Priests rehearsed ancient rites, garlands were hung along the procession route, and invitations went out to every senator and magistrate. On the appointed day, Sporus, veiled in the traditional saffron of a bride, was led through the rituals as Nero claimed him as Sabina. For many, it was both breathtaking and chilling. A living person transformed into an object of memory, bound forever to an emperor's grief and power. If stories like this remind you how fragile freedom and identity can be, support thoughtful history by liking and subscribing so more people understand the cautionary lessons the past holds. And if you choose not to, share in the comments why. Every reflection on how we tell history helps keep these discussions honest. The wedding feast that followed was a spectacle even by imperial standards, overflowing with dishes meant to impress and unsettle in equal measure. Peacocks layered with songbirds, wines uncorked from Caesar's own cellars, musicians and dancers summoned from across the empire. Rome's elite held their composure, offered congratulations, and piled gifts before the new empress. Jewelry, fine linens, even charms for fertility, each gesture a quiet calculation to remain in the emperor's favor. Senators spoke in polished phrases about the beauty of the bride. Poets recited verses celebrating a union they dared not question. Beneath the polished toasts lay a silent recognition that this was not another of Nero's indulgences but a transgression of everything Romans believed about law, custom, and human dignity. And still they applauded, because silence could cost lives. Sporus's existence as Nero's consort became a relentless performance. Each morning he woke among Poppaea's possessions, attended by the same servants who once dressed the empress. They arranged his hair, applied the cosmetics, and fastened the garments chosen to preserve an illusion. Public appearances were the most punishing. Sitting beside the emperor at games and ceremonies, carried in the empress's litter, presented to crowds who stared at a youth recast as the shadow of a dead woman. During Nero's journey through Greece, the theater grew even more surreal. Local leaders honored Sporus with the courtesies reserved for an empress. Priests in Olympia prayed for children on behalf of a couple they pretended could bear them. Behind closed doors, the strain deepened. Nero demanded not just a likeness of Poppaea but the return of her most private words and gestures. Sporus was expected to echo a memory, to know the jokes and endearments of someone gone, to meet grief with perfect imitation. Any slip could bring fury or, more chilling still, withdrawal from the man on whom his safety depended. Around the palace, attendants regarded him with a mix of sympathy, unease, and revulsion, unsure where the person ended and the role began. They told stories of finding him standing motionless in the gardens at dawn, as though uncertain how to exist when no one was watching. Escape was nearly impossible. His altered appearance and the jewelry that marked him as imperial property made him instantly recognizable. One recorded attempt ended in tragedy when those who tried to help were executed within sight of his chambers. A brutal message that even death might not release him from Nero's grasp. Yet the cruelty was often hidden behind gestures of favor. Costly gifts, protective words, hours spent in what looked like tender conversation. To observers, it could resemble love. But how can affection survive when one life has been refashioned to fit another's grief? Ancient writers hint that, over time, Sporus began to fracture under the weight of the part he was forced to play, sometimes answering to Poppaea's name, sometimes speaking as if two people lived within him. For a youth caught between survival and selfhood, blurring the boundary may have been the only way to endure. By the spring of 68 CE, the emperor's power was disintegrating. Uprisings spread, the Senate turned against him, and the Praetorian Guard abandoned their oath. Nero fled with a small circle of attendants, and Sporus remained among them, still required to embody a dream even as the state dissolved. In a villa on the edge of Rome, witnesses later described an emperor oscillating between frantic schemes and tragic rehearsals, clinging to Sporus and calling him the only proof that loss could be undone. If stories like this leave you unsettled but fascinated, consider supporting careful history work. Subscribe so these lessons aren't lost in the noise, or share in the comments how you think such episodes should be remembered. Discussion helps keep difficult history from slipping back into silence. When word reached Nero that capture was only moments away, he finally chose death. Even then, the theater of his life did not end. He called for Sporus to speak the ritual words of mourning, to play Poppaea's part one last time. With trembling hands, he pressed the dagger to his throat, and Sporus helped steady it, perhaps the only act of kindness between them, ending a nightmare that had trapped them both. But freedom did not come easily. Sporus was suddenly a symbol, a living reminder of a fallen emperor's obsessions, and each rival for the throne viewed him as a trophy or a tool. Galba, the aging general who first seized power, offered cold courtesy and kept him quietly in the palace. For a short while, Sporus drifted in an uneasy half-life, still wearing the garments chosen for him years before, still addressed by a name that was never truly his, yet no longer under Nero's constant gaze. That interlude ended with Galba's murder, and the youth passed to Otho, who had once been married to Poppaea himself. Otho's attention was more unsettling. Ancient accounts suggest he treated Sporus as a legitimate widow, even speaking of marriage, though his own reign collapsed too quickly for such plans to take shape. After Otho's suicide, the young captive was delivered to Vitellius, a man with none of his predecessor's refinement, only an appetite for crude amusement. Vitellius conceived a public spectacle in which Sporus would be forced to act out the myth of Proserpina, seized by dark spirits and dragged to the underworld. A performance meant to end in humiliation and death before a roaring crowd. Faced with that fate, Sporus claimed the only choice left to him. Sources disagree whether he took poison or opened his veins, but all agree that he died by his own hand, ending the role he had been compelled to inhabit. He was barely 20. The story leaves questions that still trouble historians. How identity can be erased by unchecked power, how complicity gathers around cruelty, how a society can look away while a single life is turned into a stage for another's grief. Physicians, tutors, attendants, senators, each played a part in sustaining the illusion, choosing safety over the humanity of a boy who deserved to live unobserved, unnamed by tragedy. If this history moves you, let it remind you why careful storytelling matters. Subscribe or follow so these voices aren't lost to the margins of textbooks, and share your thoughts about how we should remember people whose names were almost erased. Their memory depends on how we choose to speak of them. Sporus is often treated as a footnote in Nero's catalogue of excess, but behind that line in a chronicle was a human being whose body, name, and future were stripped away. In the buried halls of Nero's palace, the rooms still stand where he learned to speak in another's voice and to see a stranger in the mirror. The stones keep their silence, but we owe the boy who became a ghost the small dignity of remembrance. What lingers after Sporus' short life is not only a tale from imperial Rome, but a warning about how easily humanity can be stripped away when power faces no limits. His suffering was not an accident of history. It was built, step by step, through choices, by an emperor who believed he owned other people's bodies, and by those around him who decided their own comfort was worth more than speaking out. Modern audiences sometimes treat stories like this as curiosities, detached from the present. Yet the same forces that allowed Sporus to vanish inside someone else's fantasy, unchecked authority, public appetite for spectacle, the silence of bystanders, have never truly disappeared. They surface wherever people become objects for entertainment, status, or control. Remembering him is a way to keep watch over our own times, to recognize the signs before they harden into new tragedies. If this history has stayed with you, consider supporting responsible storytelling so these names are not erased again. Subscribe if you want to stand with work that treats the past and the people in it with care, or share your thoughts below about how we can honor lives that history almost allowed to vanish. The ruins of palaces and forums remind us that empires rise and fall, but the cost of forgetting is constant. Sporus deserves more than a line in a chronicle. He deserves to be remembered as a person whose endurance, even in silence, speaks across 2,000 years.